Priestley's son, Tom Priestley, in a restaurant in London. And we were discussing various issues. One of the things that he said, which really amazed me, was that he told me that there was a play written by his father that was virtually unknown, called Time Was, Time Is. And he said, and I said, I'd be very, very interested to discover more about this book. And Tom was very kind in having his agent send me a typed copy of the play. And I read it one beautiful summer's afternoon, and I was absolutely stunned as to how good it was. What then took place was I then contacted Tom, and he said, well, the person you really need to speak to is a gentleman called Braham Murray. And I'd heard of Braham. You know, he's really very famous over here in the UK. And I tentatively contacted him, and we had a fascinating Skype discussion. And what has developed from there is what I would genuinely say is you meet a handful of people in life where you just click immediately, and there seems to be a kind of a linkage where you can talk for hours immediately. And this is what has happened with Braham and I. We have met now on 4 or 5 occasions, and it really is a meeting of minds. I find him a fascinating man and just so interesting in terms of his life experiences. And indeed, I then subsequently discovered through Braham that he had written his autobiography called The Worst It Can Be Is a Disaster. And I read it around about 9 or 10 months ago and really enjoyed it. And I have recently, in preparation for this interview, reread it, and I have to say it is the most fascinating book, in that it is brutally honest and just a wonderful, wonderful read. Now, recently I had a chat with Braham and said, would he be willing to come on my Consciousness Hour show? And I'm delighted to say that Braham has agreed, and he is now our guest this evening. So without further ado, Braham, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I don't think I can live up to that introduction.
I'm sure you can. Braham, if for some of the listeners who will surprisingly not know about your work, can you just give us a very, very brief introduction of just a little bit about how you got into the theatre and a little bit about your background, and then we'll go into a little bit more specific details about it.
Well, I got into the theatre very early. I was initially going to be an actor, and then I was in a play where the other actors weren't good enough. This was at school. And so I said, no, you've got to do it like this. And I suddenly realized that I don't want to be an actor, I want to be a director. And that was my goal and aim. And I went to Oxford University with the desire to do that, because in those days, famous directors came from Oxford or Cambridge. And then, while I was at Oxford, age 21, I directed and co-wrote a play called Hang Under Head and Die, which transferred to New York. I left Oxford without taking my degree and became a fully fledged director. I was held as the new Orson Welles, etc., etc. I then got bloody noses, lots of disasters, and then tried to learn my profession properly by becoming artistic director of a company called the Century Theatre, which then eventually led to me being able to ask the directors much older than me who were famous, who I admired hugely, to work with me, which they said they would. And we founded what was called the 69 Theatre Company, which eventually became the Royal Exchange Theatre, which we founded in 1976, and is probably, I think, the finest theatre building in the world. That's me very briefly.
And a very good synopsis, I think, and within that there is so much detail. One of your quotations in your book that I really picked up upon was something where you said, I have tried to work with one foot in each world. And I thought from meeting you and your interest in esoteric subjects that particularly resonated with me. Because I think with your life it has been an incredible roller coaster of incredible success. For instance, as a little bit of an aside, and I'll give you the opportunity to talk about this, there is something that happened with Hang Down Your Head and Die with 2 of the actors that you worked with at that. They went on to do something else, didn't they?
Yes, in New York, the show, because we had a crazy producer who was a complete amateur, and she hated me, and eventually I hated her. She took off after one night. But we had so loved doing it, the American cast of doing the show, that when I got back to England, they would meet regularly once a month, sing the songs, and reminisce. And then I got a letter from one of them saying, we were so inspired by the free-wheeling theatre form that you introduced us to, that we have written a show. And I wrote a patronising note back saying, oh, awfully good, I'm so pleased. And then they said, well, it's going to be done off Broadway next year. And I said, well, let me know how it goes. It opened off Broadway. I got a letter saying, well, it's gone rather well, and it's going to be off Broadway next year. And I said, oh, well, it's awfully good. Still patronising. Please let me know more about it. Then I got the letter saying it's opening on Broadway. It's called Hair. And when I directed a show over here called Catch My Soul, Jerome Ragney and James Rader, who were the two people who were in the cast of Hand Down Your Head and Die, came over and said to the press, this is the guy that inspired Hair. I kept on thinking, where's my royalties? But yeah, it was a really nice thing to do.
Well, I suppose, Braham, it is to do with the dawning of the age of Aquarius. I couldn't help but resist that one, really. Absolutely, and of course, within Hang Down Your Head and Die, you had two people who were involved in that as minor actors who, as I recall, did attempt to rewrite the second act for you. Would you like to tell us who they were?
Yes, they wanted to rewrite the second act, and I absolutely failed to do it, so they went off and created Monty Python. They were Terry Jones and Michael Palin.
Just working with those two characters. Funnily enough, quite recently, as you know, I'm working at the National Gallery, and Michael Palin did a talk at the National Gallery on his favourite paintings, and it was I obviously should have taken the opportunity to have a word with him at that stage about your work and his involvement there. Also, you have said that even from a very early age, you have something inside of you that you call the wise old soul. And it was this wise old soul that turned down, of all people, Joseph E. Levine and Bernard Delfont. Can you tell us a little bit about that event and also about what you believe this is, this wise old soul that's within you?
Well, the event, briefly, was when I was in New York doing Hang Down Your Head and Die. Joseph E. Levine, movie producer, offered me a contract, $500,000 in 1964, which is a lot of money. 3-year contract, first 6 months learn how to direct movies, and then the next 2 years do 3 movies. And a voice said no, and I thought, where did that come from? And it was, of course, me. And then later, when I got back to England and was getting bloody notice because I had nobody to guide me and I was doing the wrong shows, Bernard Delfont phoned and said, I've got a new musical called Passion Flower Hotel. I'd love you to direct it. And a voice said no. Now that voice, and I think it's the voice that's in all of us, is our old souls. I think it's in all of us. It's certainly in me. It has great wisdom. It will sit there and wait for you to make your mistakes and wait for you to grow up until you do. But if you acknowledge it and if you actually talk to it, particularly before you go to sleep, it will do an awful lot of work for you. But we all have it in us, is the point.
Absolutely, and one of the things that you're probably aware is my second book, the Daemon: A Guide to Extraordinary Secret Self, and a theme that's been throughout my writing is this idea of exactly what this inner voice is and what it tells us about life and how it knows the things it knows. How does it guide and where does it get its wisdom from? And it came very, very, very much in your book, the way in which there were a series of events that carried you through your life that you could have made other decisions and you didn't. It was if you were kind of driven to take your own direction. Because, I mean, at a very young age, to turn down an opportunity like that showed incredible strength of character. But I get the impression that you were a very, very strong individual in those days. It comes across quite powerfully. I mean, for instance, the casting the Miss World Anne Sydney in Macbeth as one of the witches, I think was inspired beyond words. I mean, I remember watching Anne Sydney winning Miss World all those years ago. And of course, Macbeth is such a powerful play in itself, which I know you talk about. Now, as you developed along, there was a gentleman that came into your life called Armand Honingstat, which I was particularly intrigued in. Can you tell me a little bit about him and what he taught you about the nature of reality and life?
Well, the two directors who I finally worked with, Michael Elliott and Caspar Vrede, they both knew Armand Honingstat. Caspar Vrede, who was a Finnish baron, who at the age of 15 was fighting the Russians for Finland, who at 18 went to Oslo, was taken under the mentorship of this man Armand Honingstat, who I suppose invested him with knowledge and understanding of the moment of time in the world in which we lived, that it was a crucial moment, and how to make the best possible contribution to that world. And they decided that the most important thing at this moment in time were what artists could do, and the most important art form was theatre, because it was in the theatre where people now came, an audience, to participate with the actors who were acting the great plays about how you live your life and humanity. And now that the great religions were dying, it was the only place where that happened. Caspar knew nothing about theatre, but they went into it. They found that the centre of theatre was in England, London, and they found that there was a drama school that Michel Saint-Denis was running at the Old Vic, and Caspar went to that school, and there he met most of the other people that finally became part of the company which became the Royal Exchange Theatre. When I came banging on the door, I was only 16 and they were already nearly 30. They told me that there was this man Armand Honingstat who actually was the inspiration behind all of that. But they would never let me meet him. And then one day they said, he's here, go and pick him up from the airport. I said, right, how will I know him? How will he know me? They said, don't worry, he will know you. And I went to the airport and there was a thick fog over Heathrow. And I stood there thinking, this is ridiculous. The place was packed. And then a long, thin creature appeared and said, you are Braham Murray? And I said, yes. And it was Armand Honingstat, and he knew me. I then spent this extraordinary time with him where he told me all about myself. He told me about what the future should be and what my role should be. And then one night, we were sitting having a meal at a place that I lived in near Manchester. And we were sitting at the table, and we were talking about Beauty and the Beast, which was a story which both of us wanted to somehow make into a play. And we were discussing it. And I said to him, tell me what the beast is. He pointed to the chair to my left and said, look at that. I looked over there and there was this creature. It was an old man who morphed into an old woman. The old woman had snakes in her hair like the Gorgon. It came from one to the other. And it was as real as anything I've ever seen in my life. So you could say that he absolutely introduced me to that other world, which is a crucial part of any great theatre. All the great theatre writers, Shakespeare, Ibsen, the Greeks, all wrote about the gods, all wrote about otherness, and that's what Armand introduced me to. He was an inspired man.
Where do you think his abilities, for want of a better term, where did they come from? How did he become like that?
Nobody knows, but you see, Herna was the god that survived Ragnarok, the destruction. And so he was obviously born with it. And when he talked, he would talk as though he was continuing. I mean, he told me, he would say, the other day I was up there above the earth talking to the devil. And the devil said, who do you think wrote the Ten Commandments? And I said, well, it was God. And he said, no, it was me. How do you think I get so many people down to hell so easily? He was on talking terms with the other world. I don't know where it all came from. His personal life was pretty tragic. But this was it. He was in touch.
Because when I was reading the section, Strindberg kept coming into my mind, for just in terms of the link of the theatre and the magical. Now, clearly, as you and I have discussed many times, there is clearly a link here between what exists in the theatre and the way in which we abdicate, I suppose. We move into a different state of consciousness when we're in the theatre. And again, picking up on one of the things you were saying earlier about the voice you hear, your wise old soul, it's as if it's to do with hypnagogic states and these kind of liminal states of consciousness we move within. Now, one of your favourite writers is Dostoevsky, and it is clear to me from knowing you how that may be the case. But can you explain what it is about Dostoevsky that fascinates you so much?
Well, obviously, when I was young, I read voraciously. It was a way of living and not having to face certain things in the real world as a very young person. And then I came across the Brothers Karamazov, which throughout my life really has sustained me. At that time, it was Alyosha, the young one that I identified with. When I got into the more tortuous years, the late teenage going into the 20s, obviously it was, God, I've forgotten his name. Sorry, lost it. The tortured, tormented one. And then, of course, when I got into the 20s, it was Dmitri. And at every moment, I got to know those people. And Dostoevsky, who must have been the most tormented and difficult person, was trying to, I'm sure, as any great artist does, try to express through his art how he should be living and how he might live and how one moves forward. And in Karamazov, the priest's speech, just totally astonishing. That's what he does. Then, of course, I read the others, Crime and Punishment, which is extraordinary, Nietzschean song, just absolutely unbelievable. And then the beauty of the idiot, the purity of the idiot. It just, to me, he went further into what was really going on in our psyches and our souls than any other writer.
I totally agree with you. I was particularly taken with Prince Myshkin, the idiot, and the way in which Dostoevsky creates him as a character and the tortured soul that he was. And I was particularly fascinated by one of the sections in The Idiot. I think it's in The Idiot. You could probably correct me on this if I'm wrong on this, where there is an execution, and there is a mock execution takes place, and the character thinks they're going to be shot, and then they're able to count the number of tiles on the church opposite. And I was quite surprised to discover that that was written from life, because apparently he was part of the Petroshki circle that tried to assassinate Alexander II, and he did apparently go through a mock execution. So here we have, the kind of the writing, the visceral writing that's so powerful. It's interesting you say about writers and novels that you go back to through your life. I do that with John Fowles' The Magus. I read it once every 10 years, and I have done for decades now. And every time I identify with a different character, and I'm now at the level of Conchise, the old man in it. As I'm into my 60s now, I can see Conchise's point of view. Whereas originally I was Nicky Orth, I was Nicholas Earth, and I was so like him in terms of personality. But John Fowles to me is a wonderful writer because of the way he applies postmodernism to the way he writes and introducing the author into the situation. Moving on, just as a very quick aside, when you did Catch My Soul, which I remember seeing many, many years ago, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful, was that you had PJ Proby, the split-trousered character, as part of the cast. And you tell an interesting story about his pronunciation of one of the characters, which I thought was quite telling. And also, go on, what was it? Again?
It was simply that he didn't want to be playing Cassio. He wanted to play the character that he called I Eagle.
which probably sums him up. And of course, there was the other incident, which apparently you got into the national papers involving you and Marianne Faithfull.
Yes, it was a very difficult moment. My first marriage was breaking up, and divorce was on the cards. And we were on tour with Catch My Soul, and the actress playing Desdemona wasn't right. She couldn't sing well enough, and I had to replace her. And it was suggested that Marianne Faithfull might be the person, and that she would come up to Birmingham, and I would take her to the show and see how we got on. So that was fine. So I was in my hotel room before the show, and the phone rang. They told me she was downstairs. Could she come up? She came up, and of course, the most beautiful creature came into my room and said, could she have a drink? And I said, yes, of course. So I opened the bar and I gave her a drink. And she said, and she downed it and said, could she have another one? And I said, yes, okay. So I gave her another one. And then she took out some pills, and she put pills in her mouth. And it all went rather odd. But I thought, my God, I've got to get her to the theatre. So I kind of got her to the theatre. And she sat down, we started watching the show. And at a certain moment, she just slumped. And so I picked her up, and I took her back to my room, and put her in my room. And that was fine. And then I thought, what am I going to do? So I went down and found out where there was another room where I could put her. And so they came and they took her and they put her in another room. And then the next morning there was a knock on the door, and there was her fiancé, who was a lord, who was going to marry her. And he was furious, determined that I was doing the wrong thing with Marianne Faithfull. And unfortunately, it all got in the newspapers. It was headlines in what was then the evening news, which doesn't happen anymore. My mother phoned up with a terrible statement and said, what's going to happen to your divorce, you idiot? I said, but I haven't done anything. So that's basically what happened.
So he suspected it was Marianne Unfaithful then, I guess.
Absolutely, yes.
But you could have got yourself into quite a situation there, because am I right in saying that she's a direct relative or descendant of Masok?
Oh, they didn't know that.
I think so. I think I'm right in that, which makes things even more complex.
Yes.
I was also surprised to discover when I was doing some research in Marianne Faithfull that her father was comparatively local to where I come from, and he actually came from on the outskirts of Liverpool, which which did surprise the life out of me, really. But then again, you've been very much a guideline for an awful lot of very, very interesting ladies. I mean, I was amazed to discover that you gave Helen Mirren her first professional acting debut in Ortolan, Michael Mayer's play, which again, so she must have been very young then.
Well, she was. I saw her play Cleopatra in the National Youth Theatre production. And actually, the first play she did for me was Charlie's Aunt, actually. So she was she hadn't even gone to drama school. It was all the National Youth Theatre, so she can't have been more than 19 or 20 when I worked with her.
Wow. Because this is the thing, that there is so many little side stories in the book that fascinate me. Moving on now to an area that is very much part of my own interest in writing is the J.M. Barrie play Mary Rose, and how you came involved in that, and in fact the massive coup you had and the actress you managed to get into the role. I mean, this, guys, everybody listening in, this is going to blow your mind. This is really incredible. So let's talk about Mary Rose, the play, and then the background to it, who you managed to get involved in with, and who did the music for it as well, which also stunned me, because he's one of my favourite composers, which I don't think we've ever discussed.
Right, yes, but it's the other way around. It started off because my agent phoned me one day and said, I represent Mia Farrow. I wanted to do a play, and she wants to do a play. Would you go and meet her? Have you any ideas? I said, well, certainly go and meet her. Are you kidding? And I'll try and think of some ideas. And she was at that time in Bordeaux making a movie over there, so I was going to be flown out in order to meet her there. And I was having round to dinner a company manager, a wonderful lady called Alison, and we were sitting having dinner and having a drink, and she suddenly went, Mary Rose, Mary Rose. I said, what's that, Alison? And she said, oh, it's a wonderful play, a wonderful play. I don't know why I sung that. You should read it. And I said, really? She said, yes, read it. And so I bought it. I'd never read anything else by James Barrie apart from Peter Pan. And it was the most wonderful story about this girl that lives and lives, doesn't die, and remains a child, invades people's lives, etc., etc. And I thought, my God, this is Mia Farrow. So I was flown out to Bordeaux, and I met her, and I gave her the play, and she read it, and she said, absolutely yes. And she was quite wonderful, and it's a very difficult part. You have to be more than a good actress. You have to have something very special, incredibly pure in you, and especially spiritually in you. She had it to perfection. It was wonderful to work with her.
Yes, I've heard this from various sources, that she has, because she has this incredible gay mind quality and the kind of incredible level of being vulnerable. I remember fascinated, I watched her in, Woody Allen did Woody Allen did a version of A Midsummer Night's Dream many years ago, which was a group of people meeting together in the 1920s in a country house in upstate New York. I can't remember the title of it now, but she was absolutely ethereal in that. She was absolutely amazing. So it must have been wonderful to have her, but in terms of the role. But on top of that, the music that you involved there was quite interesting as well, wasn't it?
Well, yes, I had heard this record or recording of John Taverner's work, and I had loved it, and I did what I very rarely do. I actually wrote him a fan letter and said, I have heard The Whale, which was the name of the piece that he'd written, and I just think it's amazing, and I would love to work with you. And we met, and he, like me, was an Aquarian, and we got on like a house on fire, and became very, very close. And when I did Mary Rose, I said, will you compose the music for it? And he said yes. And so he did. And of course, this is going to be silly because Mia Farrow was also an Aquarian. So we became a very close trio. They became great friends, and his music was, of course, absolutely wonderful.
Because I was surprised again to discover that he had been signed by Apple Records when the Beatles set up Apple. Again, and somebody who was, an avant-garde composer to be involved in that kind of world really shows how his music can is timeless almost. I bought was it the Revealing Veil? I think it was something like that. I've got the CD of that because he became very involved in. Well, he became Greek Orthodox, didn't he? As I recall.
Yes, he did. We were very close about all that, and indeed, I attended church services with him. He loved the Greek Orthodox. It was very, very important to him, and he became friends with another person, Jared McClarnon, playwright, who became Greek Orthodox as well because of him. It was very important to him indeed.
That's interesting because McClarnon, as I recall, was a Northern Irish Catholic, wasn't he? Because he'd written some very, very contentious plays about the Troubles, and I know that he didn't go down terribly well on the streets of East Belfast when he wrote one of his first plays. But that really dovetails in very interestingly to the work you did with Gerard when you wrote The Trial of Joan of Arc, which you did many years ago, which again is interesting because, of course, there's the Joan of Arc concept of the voices and the way in which the voices guided Joan. So again, we have a link again with this kind of idea of something guiding us. In terms of Mary Rose, the storyline, what is the actual reason? Was Mary Rose actually taken away by the elementals in Scotland and she came back? Because I don't know the story terribly well.
Yes, they went to an island, and she went under a rowan tree and she disappeared, and therefore her family had to come back without her, imagine that she was dead, but she wasn't. As I say, you then have a big time jump, and she comes back to her, who was her lover, as it were. But everybody else has got much older, and she is still very young. But yes, the spirits have taken her away.
Right, because I'm at the moment researching for my next book, and one of the books I'm reading is the Evans Vents book on the fairy folk in Celtic communities. And I think he did research around about 1910, something like that. So this very much ties in, and it's interesting whether J.M. Barrie was aware of what Vents was writing. And I'm also intrigued by your reference there to the Rowan tree, because the character Rowan features in The Wicker Man, and a young girl that disappears in The Wicker Man is called Rowan. And interesting as an aside, my sister named her daughter Rowan, based upon the character in The Wicker Man, which is intriguing in itself. And she's only recently explained that to me. So moving on then, so the other thing that, one of the reasons I mentioned, before we finish this, there was a very interesting encounter at the end of a performance of Mary Rose that struck me. Can you explain about that?
Yes, it was the first night of Mary Rose, and the curtain had come down, the applause had been taken, and then what happens is that if you go backstage, you go out to the theatre and you walk round the back, etc., etc. And then suddenly a woman got up and started striding across the stage to backstage. And I went down and said, "Hey, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing?" She said, "I'm going to see Mia." And I realised it was Catherine Hepburn. And I was completely dumbstruck. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I said, "Oh, yes, of course, I'll take you back there." Which I did, which was wonderful. When I got back there, another man came up to me and said, "Thank you for bringing magic back into the theatre." And it was Noel Coward. And again, I couldn't speak. I mean, I thought, this is just totally astonishing. It was a great opening.
What an accolade. Noel Coward, it's just mind-blowing to actually just hear those words from somebody like that is incredible. Incredible. And of course, the link here with J.M. Barrie is to our next subject, which is the subject that links us both, which is our mutual interest in J.B. Priestley. Because I in my new book, I discuss how Priestley was influenced, or was very closely associated with J.M. Barrie. And I know Priestley mentions Mary Rose in one or two of his articles, because of course you did an amazing production, it sounds, of The Good Companions, which is, well, you can explain The Good Companions and how you did this, because Judi Dench was part of that, wasn't it? And the music was by Andre Previn. So can you tell a little bit about that?
Well, yes, because of Mary Rose, because Mia Farrow was married to Andre Previn, he approached me one day and said, "Mia thinks you're great. Would you be interested in directing a musical of Priestley's The Good Companions?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know anything about that." And he said, "Well, read it. Tell me what you think." So I read it and loved it. I mean, it's an amazing picaresque novel, which is actually a Jungian individuation process novel, actually, but that it's so entertaining and wonderful. And I said, "Of course I'll do that." And he had the great American lyricist Johnny Mercer, Off My Baby One More for the Road, already in tow. And we approached Ronnie Harwood, now Sir Ronald Harwood, to write the book, so it was a hell of a thing. And then when I was thinking about Priestley, I suddenly remembered that years ago when I was at school, boarding school, we had play reading sessions every Friday night. And we read this incredible play called Time at the Conways. And I loved it. I'd forgotten all about it. I suddenly thought, I'd love to do that. I reread it and thought, this is an amazing play. So we phoned, this is now the Royal Exchange, or just in a temporary theatre before we moved into the big one. We got in touch with the agent who said, "Sorry, he won't allow it to be done. It's never been done since its very first performance in the West End all those years ago." So I started casting another play, and then I got a phone call saying, "Just want to tell you he's changed his mind." And I said, "Wow, that's fantastic." And so I did it in this temporary theatre, and he came. Well, first of all, I went to meet him, and his wife to Ken the Hawks at Kissing Tree House. And we got on famously well, really. I knew he'd written a book about Jung, and I was a Jungian, and he was a Jungian, and so on and so forth. And he told me about Ouspensky, etc., etc., etc. And then he came and saw it. I was terrified. Priestley has come to see my production, and I put him in his seat, and I went next door and got a drink, and then got a drink for him in the interval. And he came out in the interval, and he said, "Yeah, give me that whiskey." And I gave him the whiskey, and he drank it. And he went back in again, and I thought, "Oh God, he obviously hates it." He came out for the second interval, and said, "Could I have another whiskey?" And I gave him another whiskey, and he drank it. And he went back in, and I thought, "Well, that's it. He obviously hates it." But then he came out at the end, and he said, "That second act is one of the greatest acts in modern theatrical history." And I said, "Yes, no, I absolutely agree." And then finally it turned out that he did actually love it. And we became even greater friends after that. So I got to know him very well indeed.
Wow, because Priestley, funnily enough, as an aside, the last time Braham and I met, just for an aside for everybody else, we had dinner with J.B. Priestley's granddaughter, Karen, and his great-grandson, Luke. And the four of us had a fascinating conversation about Priestley in the background, because one of the areas that we both are fascinated by in terms of Priestley is his fascination with Jung and Ouspensky. And I know that you had the opportunity, which I would have loved to have done had time ever been on my side, to have sat down with him and discussed in more detail his ideas about Jung and Ouspensky. Can you tell us a little bit about what you talked about during those times, and any interesting snippets of information about Priestley's feelings on these things?
Well, that's a bit tricky because it was an awfully long time ago. It would have been over a series of time. Well, Jung was very, very straightforward, because I had read his book. I'd read a lot of Jung, and that, I think, gave him confidence in me, if you like. Ouspensky was very interesting because he was talking about all kinds of ways in which you could cope with your problems and yourself. And I had read, was it the third dimension, the third estate? I can't remember what it was called. It was just absolutely amazing book. I can't remember those conversations in much detail, I'm afraid. But I'd say they were a long time ago.
But you have, am I right in saying that you have directed or produced a performance of I Have Been Here Before in your career? Am I right in that?
No, I haven't. I want to, because I think it's the most amazing play. But it's very, very, very difficult to cast that leading role.
As we discussed recently, I saw the German theatre version a few months ago, and as we were discussing last time we met, I think that the Gordler character could be played by a younger man, possibly, to make it slightly different. But as you say, it's such a difficult role because he has these speeches that are quite complex and quite difficult for an audience to understand. I was also, in my book, I discuss in some detail Dragon's Mouth that he wrote with Giacoetta, which really plays upon the Jungian archetypes, the Jungian personalities, which I thought was very intriguing as well. And as far as I'm aware, that's being done really. But this is the tragedy, isn't it, of Priestley, is that so much of his work just has been lost in many ways. And in terms of your knowledge of Priestley, which plays do you really which resonate with you?
Well, obviously, Time and the Conways, which I've done twice. I've been here before, Inspector Calls. But then there's lots of others. The Linden Tree, for example, is a very, very good play. I can't remember them all, but I think the problem with Priestley is that, rather like Shakespeare, he was able to write for anybody. He was able to grip anybody. And then he would slip the Mickey Finn into it, the thing that he really wanted to say, he really wanted to communicate. So people have kind of dismissed him as a populist, which is rubbish. He was a very, very special writer indeed. And particularly at this time, we need to rediscover his works.
Oh, we certainly do. I mean, for instance, one of the plays when I was doing my research that particularly I thought was very, very powerful was Desert Highway, which, you know, is virtually unknown. But this again is a very, very similar structure to Time and the Conways, in that the first act is a group of soldiers out in Syria in the Second World War, English Tommies, and the second act, the same English Tommies are suddenly way back, probably around about 1,000 years BC, where the Persian invasions were taking place, and it's very, very cleverly done, and it's the idea of the Jungian idea of the collective unconscious and the way in which these themes carry through our lives in certain ways. Now, we'll move back to Priestley later as we're in our discussion, but I just very quickly want to move into your interest in the Kabbalah, and particularly what sounded like a production, I think, of all your productions I would love to have seen, your production of the Die Book. Can you tell us a little bit about the concept of what a Die Book is, and how it links to the Kabbalah and your own interest in the Kabbalah?
Yes, it's a Dibbook, actually.
Dibbook, sorry.
It is the spirit of someone who, when he dies, leaves the body of the person that's died and enters into someone else's being and controls them. And this particular play, the Dibbook, is about a young man and a young girl, and the man loves the girl, but the father doesn't want him to marry her. He wants her to marry a rich fella, and this guy is a student of Kabbalah, and so he refuses to let her marry him, and the boy seems to die, but actually enters into the girl, and she speaks with his voice from then onwards. And all kinds of efforts are made to try and exorcise. There's an wonderful exorcism scene, and people are interrogated from the dead who might help with it, and none of it works. But at the end of the play, what is remarkable is that the boy reincarnates, although he's dead, and marries the girl who is alive. So the two worlds, because the subtitle of the play is called Between Two Worlds, coincide, and the marriage takes place between one world and another world, which is extraordinary. When I read it, I said, you couldn't believe how wonderful it was. And I thought, I've got to find out about this. So I started reading Kabbalah at that moment. Kabbalah is extraordinary. It was purely verbal, handed down from generation to generation, and only became written down at all in the Zohar many, many years later. And it is completely different from Orthodox Judaism, but completely. I'll give you one example. God is Elohim, which is plural. Therefore, God is male and female. The Jewish God, Yahweh, is only on one of his shoulders, on the left-hand shoulder. It's extraordinary. It is about the transmigration of souls. It's about reincarnation. Quite astonishing. I went to Jews College to talk to the rabbi who was in charge of Jews College in order to talk to him about it. And when I brought it up, he simply said, it is difficult enough to live in this world and to cope with it, and that's what we have to do. Say, our some-part souls that one drops from another world, I'm not interested. And in Manchester, rabbis preached in their sermons not to go and see it, but it was subversive. Fortunately, audiences disagreed with that. I think it is almost the most remarkable spiritual play ever written. Quite extraordinary.
I am very keen to see it. I will keep my eye out to see whenever there's going to be a production of this.
Well, it needs a huge cast. I very much doubt you'll likely to see one given the under-subsidised theatre as it exists today.
How very sad. How very sad. I mean, the thing with my ideas on Kabbalah and everything else is it intrigues me, because what you're basically saying there is Gnosticism, isn't it? The idea that there is a reality behind the reality, and Jehovah that we consider to be is actually the demiurge, is the half creator, and there is a place behind the pleroma, which which is the reality behind this reality. And I'm always taken within Jewish mysticism the concept of the Or Ein Sof, and the idea that there is a ground of everything that is a singularity, and we are all emanations of this singularity. And isn't there something about the breaking of the cups or the chalices, the idea that there's a breaking within each of us is a part of the pleroma that is waiting to come out? Could that be, when you were talking earlier about this idea of the wise old soul, is that the kind of this trying to break out into this reality in some way?
That's right. The old soul for Jews is called Ruach.
Yeah.
That is Kabbalah. Yes, absolutely right.
Absolutely. Right, just moving on again, I would just touch upon two of the other people that you worked with in your career. But I like chalk and cheese in many ways, but still left out to me was Alan Price and Adam Ant. Sort of very, very different characters. And I think I'm right in saying that you worked with Alan Price on a production of Andy Capp, I think. Was that right?
Yeah. I've done several shows with Alan Price, and in fact he's just completed a new one, which we hope will be done very soon. But Andy Capp, and then Who's a Lucky Boy, which he wrote as well. As I say, a third one is in process now. I think he's a marvelous composer, and he again actually composes on another level. He's got very important things to say. His genius is that he knows how to touch people.
Yes.
En masse. He knows how to do it. His lyrics are very, very perceptive, but they're couched in such a way that they're accepted and taken on inwards. We're great friends.
Next time you see him, when you say that his song "Don't Stop the Carnival"
yes.
Was one of the most influential records I'd ever heard, because even now, that line, "This is England on a winter's day" or something, and it just struck me very, very powerfully. Now, for our American listeners, Alan Price was a founder member of the Animals, so you'll all probably remember Eric Burdon and the Animals, but Alan Price was as much the main man of that band all those years ago, and is, as you rightly say, an incredibly talented songwriter. Now, moving on, before we move on to the final thing which I want to talk about, is many, many years ago, back in 1980, I picked up a book called Ridley Walker when I was living in North London, and it blew me away. I became a huge fan of the author Russell Hoban, and I read many of his other books. Turtle Diary in particular I thought was absolutely wonderful, but Ridley Walker was the most amazing book, and I was absolutely stunned to discover that you were responsible for the stage production of Ridley Walker on stage, and not only that, but that Russell actually changed part of the ending as well, which sounded very, very Jungian. So for a couple of minutes, can you just talk about Ridley Walker? What is magical about it? And indeed, what is incredible about Russell Hoban as a writer?
Well, Ridley Walker is about a puppeteer, and this is after the bomb, and when the world has been devastated, it's beginning to start over from scratch, and beginning to build itself up. And he is a puppeteer who takes a puppet show round, portraying the myth of what actually happened. It's very difficult to describe the wonderful way in which he takes things, like Canterbury is Canterbelly. So it's and there are all kinds of misnomers that the puppeteer takes on, that shows us what has happened. I read it and thought it was absolutely wonderful. It had been recommended to me, and someone said to me, "You can make a play of it." And I thought, yes, and I met Russ, who was a great man. I mean, wonderful. Lived in this wonderful house in Chelsea. Had this room which was full of puppets and books and artifacts and magical, absolutely superb. And we decided we would do it. And we tried getting someone to adapt it, and it just didn't work because it's so original and so particular. So finally I said, you got to do it. He said, well, I can't write a play. I said, yes, you can. I will dramaturge it. And I think he went through about 10 versions, and I helped him do that. And well, I know I made it work. And then we did it with David Threlfall playing Ridley Walker quite brilliantly. And it was a huge success if you liked it, and if you didn't, it wasn't. There was an awards that the sort of the equivalent of Time Out in Manchester did at the end of the year, and it won the award for the best show of the year, and it also got the votes for the worst show. So if you couldn't take what it was doing and what it was saying, you would hate it. But what he also did, because I said to him, the book ends and we're left in a terrible state. Nothing seems to be growing. Surely the great thing is if this puppeteer begins to create a vision of the future for his puppets. And Russ said, yeah. And so he rewrote the end so that it is upbeat and shows the way forward. It was a wonderful show, one of my great experiences.
Yeah, because reading it, when I first read it, it takes time to get into the language because language has deteriorated. And you spend time, like, for instance, Eustace's story, the way they play with St. Eustace and the idea of the cross between the antlers of the deer. But also you realise that Eusa actually is a corruption of the USA. And then you have the dancing Adam. And you realise that this has been an atomic war. And I always like Do It Over for Dover, which I always thought was quite amusing as well. Wonderful book, and you have me really wanting to reread it again, I think. Now, before we move on to Time Was, Time Is, which is the new play, I'd just like you very quickly to describe your meeting with Woody Allen in New York, because then again, I thought there was a standout bit of my mate Braham with Woody Allen, which is good.
Well, I've done a show written by John Lahr called The Bluebird of Unhappiness, again at the Royal Exchange, which was John Lahr taking Woody Allen's sketches, Woody Allen's monologues, and making them into a review, basically. I did it with a marvellous cast. And West End impresario Michael White said he'd like to take it to London, then off-Broadway. And apparently Woody Allen agreed, which was great. And then John Lahr and I flew out to New York in order to see him because although they were Woody Allen sketches, they were never meant to be performed. So he had punchlines, I wanted punchlines, etc., etc. And so I did a recording of the show, just a sound recording of the table. And so I went and met him. I can't remember which movie he was editing, but I met him. Very dour, very kind of slightly nervy, not very charming person. But yeah, and I knew he was married to Mia Farrow as well, which was another thing. But he said, yes, fine, leave me the recording, that'll be fine. Then I got back to England, and then I got the call saying, you can't do the show, I hate the recording, you can't come to New York with it. I hate the way they're acting. And I thought, well, it's just the sound, and it's a stage version. I had wonderful actors, a marvellous cast, people like Derek Willis and Trevor Peacock and Hayden Quinn, goodness knows who, just absolutely marvellous. And I tried to get in touch, but his general manager phoned me and said, Graham, he said, he is a monomaniac, and I'm amazed he ever let you do the play in the first place. There's no way he would ever have let it go any further. I said, but they have wonderful reviews. He said, makes no difference, he's a monomaniac, forget it. And that was it.
Which is most unfortunate, isn't it, really? It really is, but one of those things. Just finally, one of the actresses that, well, you say actor nowadays, don't we? We don't say actress, but one of the actors that you've worked with over your years is Gabrielle Drake. And I just love to actually just reference this, that one of my favourite singer-songwriters is Nick Drake. And of course, Nick, again, if he takes the opportunity to listen to this, my friend Ed one of my close friends in Liverpool, Ed Gilchrist, shared rooms with Nick Drake at Cambridge. And indeed was there when Nick was actually writing some of his classic songs. So I thought at some stage in the future I'd introduce you to this guy as well, because some fascinating things there. But now moving on to the reason that you and I got in contact is this wonderful play, Time Was, Time Is. Now, for the last 10 minutes of the interview, can you tell us a little bit about the play, what you're doing with the play, what your hopes are for the play, and what the future of the play will be? Because I know you and I have been discussing this now for around about 6 or 7 months at least, probably longer. And the final chapter of my book, and by the way, everybody, Braham actually has kindly written one of the 3 forewords to my new book as well, so you'll have Braham's introduction as well to the book. But let's just discuss this wonderful, wonderful play.
Well, very, very strange. An author friend of mine, Canadian, Braham Fraser, who plays it a lot of, suddenly sent me a play called Time Is Time, and I emailed him back and said, the hair on my neck stood on end, because years ago, I said, I remember J.B. Priestley gave me a play called Time Was, Time Is. Brad said, well, yes, and I saw your production of Time of the Conways, which is why I wrote this play with that. I said, great, and I thought no more about it. And then I was trying to find a copy of Hamlet, which I had cut and done with goblins many years ago, so I was thinking of reviving it. And it was a stack of scripts, which was taking up far too much in my room. So I started going through it to find this cut version of Hamlet. About an hour later, I found it. As I pulled it out came Time Was, Time Is by J.B. Priestley. And I thought, I didn't know I had it. I'd forgotten it. I must read it. And I read it and thought it was absolutely brilliant, the ultimate time play. I remembered that in 1974, when he gave it to me, I had not thought it was right, because the play starts in 1914 and goes to 1974, and the 1974 dialogue didn't seem quite modern enough, and politically I wasn't very interested in what was happening. Now when I read it, 1974 has also become a period piece, and the dialogue was fine, but more than that, the 1914 part of the play was the assassination of the Archduke at Sarajevo, which started the First World War, and it's this country house gathering. When this news comes through of the assassination, everyone says, oh, well, that will blow over, no one's going to pick it up. One of the characters, who is a politician, says, when you have a lot of hard, big egos in charge of countries, things like this can make them start posturing and lead to war. And I thought, my God, this is about now. This is absolutely relevant. It is a time play where 2 characters from 1974 go back to 1914 and then go through different periods and different eras, and then finally end back in 1974. And they're a husband and wife who are on the verge of breaking up, but re-find themselves through this experience that they've been through. It is the most complex time play, and it is totally mesmerizing and brilliant. We sent it to the artistic director who was there at Chichester, who had never heard, well, nobody had, because I was the only person who ever copied. He loved it, but he had already got his last season. He is now wanting to produce it, hopefully in the West End. We're in the process of casting it. And I believe when it is seen, Priestley will be seen for what he is, a great playwright.
Absolutely. I mean, I think after Tom Priestley and yourself, I think I was the 3rd person to read it. And as I said, I read it in an afternoon sitting in the garden. And I came out and I was stunned. I found it so clever, the way in which the characters interweave. And it has elements of many of his other plays. So there's kind of a feeling of Johnson over Jordan. But I then started doing some research of my own for my book on Priestley, which will be out in January. And I was delighted to discover that the play is in fact based upon a short story that he wrote in the early 1950s called, I think it's Look After the Strange Girl, which appeared in a collection of short stories called The Other Place. Now, again, if you read The Other Place, if that had been written by Borges, people would have been going on about what a work of genius it is. But because it's Priestley, there is somehow this kind of negative feeling. And people cannot see through the fact that this guy was they feel he was very much a period writer of the 1930s. In fact, he was so far ahead of the curve, people couldn't even see what he was doing. And I can imagine his frustrations. I can just imagine how annoying what it was for him towards the end of his life to be seen as being irrelevant in some way, when in fact he was ahead of the game. And you and I both agree that if this play appears, and there's absolutely every reason to know that it will blow people's minds. It will suddenly make people realise that there was this guy from years ago writing things that are now such tropes in Hollywood movies. My only fear is that people will turn around and say, oh, it's taken so many things from so many of the movies that's been out in the last 10 or 15 years, and yet he was writing it years ago. And this is the thing we have to get across to the audiences, that this is the guy that started it all, as he did with his time plays, didn't he, Braham? You know, the time plays are so brilliantly put together. Time and the Conways, you know, between Act 1 and Act 2 is a wonderful piece of theatrical work. Did you see the production of Time and the Conways at the National Theatre that I spoke before a few years ago?
No, once I'm directed at that, I don't go and see the production because I think, why are they doing it like that, not like me?
Which I can understand totally. But I can't remember the name of the director now. It's quite frustrating. I should do. But the director did some very... Pardon? Rupert Gould, of course it was, yeah, because he's got something on the West End at the moment, hasn't he, I think. And how cleverly he did the conveying of Ouspensky's idea of split time and movement, and he used to strobe light with various actresses, a group of actresses, all dressed as Kay Conway, all in different positions. You know, so he was very much, and of course, although Priestley never discusses it, you know, clearly he was influenced by Einstein, he was influenced by Minkowski, the idea of block time that Miss Minkowski discusses. He really did his research. So we're almost up for time, which is absolutely fantastic. I think we've done incredibly well. Very much, what are your plans now for the future? What's in the world of Braham Murray these days? With the exception of this play, is there anything else that you have ideas and thoughts about?
Well, I'm doing an opera in Boston, which I've written a scenario for, called Schoenberg in Hollywood, about that great composer who had a fascinating, extraordinary life, escaping from Nazi Germany and ending up in America. And hopefully reviving a play by Ronald Harwood called Poison Pen, which again is about a schizophrenic split personality. Philip Heseltine, if you remember him,
yes,
the critic. Those are the three. Those and the new Alan Price musical, which actually I'm going to hear the final version of on Wednesday, and hopefully that will at least showcase this year and hopefully take place next year.
Is the Schoenberg piece the Todd Machover work?
Yes, it is, absolutely.
Because whatever happened, you were working on a production of Skellig with Todd.
Yes,
did that?
Yes. We did it. It was done at the Sage in Newcastle.
Oh, right, because you mentioned in your book that it was about to be, and I was really intrigued. Right. Because one of the most amazing coincidences took place a few days ago when I was reading through the book, and I saw the name Todd Machover, and Todd and I had been in touch because Todd has done an opera based upon Valis, written by Philip K. Dick, and of course one of my previous books and my previous foray into literary writing or writing about a subject of literature was my book on Philip K. Dick and the influences of Philip K. Dick. And Todd and I were in contact, and in fact I contacted Todd and mentioned that you and I were in contact, and he was absolutely stunned and as amazed as you are, because we didn't realise we had this mutual contact with this guy.
He's a wonderful. This will be my third opera, but I've done it. He's a wonderful, wonderful composer. He was American Composer of the Year last year.
Wow, so he's going into greater things, isn't he? Fascinating. Because the music, the Valis just gets it so right. It really does. It's a perfect piece. And we both, as I discovered today, we both own copies of it. So, which is not bad. Okay, well,
you have to fly to Boston next year to see it.
I will. I definitely will. I'm looking for an excuse. So any excuse to go up to Boston is my favorite city in America. So I will try and do that. Okay, thank you very much for spending your time with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. We managed to get everything in I wanted, but I think we need you back anyway because we need to discuss how things were developing with Time Was, Time Is in the future. But thanks everybody for listening in. And as always, my thanks to Radia Nunez in the background over there in Denver, Colorado, who without her assistance and work, this show could not occur. Thank you very much and everything else, and we'll be talking to you again in a month's time. Thank you.